I never thought owning a snowmobile and living in the mountains of Vermont would turn me into public enemy number one. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia Winters moved into Aspen Ridge Estates and took over our homeowners association with an iron fist. My name is Newman, and I've lived in this mountain community just outside of Stowe for 12 years. I bought my property back when the HOA was relaxed and mostly concerned with keeping the shared roads plowed and making sure nobody painted their house neon pink. Back then, we were neighbors who helped each other. That all changed 3 years ago when Patricia and her committee of busybodies decided that what our peaceful mountain neighborhood really needed was a complete overhaul of rules and regulations. The first major blizzard of the season hit in late January, and it was a monster. The National Weather Service had been warning us for days that this system was going to dump at least 3 feet of snow across northern Vermont, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour creating whiteout conditions. Most people in Aspen Ridge had the good sense to stock up on supplies and hunker down. I made sure my generator was fueled up, my woodshed was full, and my 2 snowmobiles were ready to go. You see, I've always been the unofficial rescue guy in our neighborhood. My property sits right at the edge of the development. I've got a workshop full of equipment, and I genuinely enjoy helping people out. Over the years, I've pulled cars out of ditches, delivered emergency supplies to snowed-in neighbors, and even helped get Mrs. Henderson to the hospital when her husband had a heart attack during a winter storm. It's just what you do in a mountain community. Or at least, it used to be. The storm hit on a Thursday evening. By midnight, we already had 18 inches on the ground with no signs of letting up. My phone started buzzing around 1 in the morning. It was Doug Miller from 3 streets over. "Marcus, thank God you answered," he said, his voice tight with panic. "My wife went into labor early. The roads are completely blocked and the ambulance can't get up here. They're staging at the bottom of the mountain." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, I told him, already pulling on my thermal gear. "Get Sarah ready to move." I fired up my larger snowmobile, the one with the rescue sled attached, and headed out into the howling darkness. The wind was absolutely brutal, and visibility was maybe 10 feet at best. But I knew these roads like the back of my hand. I made it to Doug's place, got Sarah loaded safely into the insulated sled with plenty of blankets, and transported her down the mountain to where the ambulance was waiting. The paramedics said I probably saved both her and the baby's life by getting her there when I did. I got back home around 3 in the morning, frozen solid but feeling good about helping out. Then my phone rang again. It was elderly Tom Preston, who lived alone in one of the houses near the north entrance. "Marcus, I hate to bother you, but my power's out and my backup generator won't start," he said. "It's getting pretty cold in here." "Sit tight, Tom. I'm on my way." I spent the next 2 hours getting Tom's generator working and making sure he had enough fuel to last through the storm. By the time I made it back home, the sun was starting to come up, though you could barely tell through the still falling snow. I'd been running my snowmobile for almost 5 hours straight, well past the HOA's ridiculous 10 p.m. curfew for motorized recreational vehicles. I should have known Patricia would find out. 3 days after the storm, when everything had finally been cleared and life was getting back to normal, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address was the Aspen Ridge Estates HOA. I opened it right there at the mailbox, and my jaw dropped. The letter informed me that I was being fined $2,000 for operating a recreational vehicle past the established curfew of 10 p.m. It cited Section 14, Paragraph 7 of the HOA bylaws, which Patricia and her committee had rammed through at a meeting last summer that hardly anyone attended. The letter was cold and bureaucratic, with no consideration for the circumstances. It didn't matter that I'd been rescuing neighbors. Rules were rules, according to Patricia. I drove straight to her house. Patricia lived in one of the newer, larger homes in the development, the kind with the perfectly manicured lawn that she somehow kept pristine even in winter. She answered the door in her typical outfit, expensive athleisure, where that had never seen the inside of a gym, perfectly styled blonde hair, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. "Marcus," she said, not even pretending to be friendly. "I assume you received the notification." "Patricia, are you serious with this? I was helping people during an emergency." "The bylaws don't have an exception clause for what you consider emergencies," she said, crossing her arms. "You operated a motorized vehicle past curfew." Multiple neighbors reported the noise. "I was saving lives. You were disturbing the peace." Sarah Miller could have waited until morning for proper medical transport, and Tom Preston's comfort isn't worth disrupting the entire neighborhood. I stared at her in disbelief. Sarah was in active labor. Tom's house was dropping into the 40s. These weren't minor inconveniences. The HOA board met yesterday and voted unanimously to uphold the fine. You have 30 days to pay. If you refuse, we'll place a lien on your property. She started to close the door, then paused. "And Marcus, consider this a warning. The next violation will be $4,000. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The sheer callousness of it all was staggering. I'd lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, helped countless people, and this was how I was being treated for doing the right thing. That evening I called my lawyer, Steve Morrison, who I'd known since college. After explaining the situation, there was a long silence on the other end. "Marcus, I'm not going to lie to you," Steve finally said. "HOA law in Vermont is tricky. If the bylaws were legally established and you violated them, they have the right to fine you. The fact that you were helping people during an emergency might generate some sympathy, but legally speaking, you don't have much ground to stand on unless they didn't follow proper procedure in creating the rule. So I just have to pay it. You could fight it in court, but that'll cost you more than $2,000 in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'd win. I'm sorry, buddy. HOAs have a shocking amount of power." I paid the fine the next day, but something fundamental had changed inside me. If Patricia and the HOA wanted to punish me for helping people, then fine. I was done being the neighborhood rescue service. I printed out a copy of the HOA bylaws and read through all 67 pages of mind-numbing regulations. Patricia and her board had been busy. There were rules about everything. What color Christmas lights you could use, how long you could leave your garage door open, what types of plants were acceptable in your yard, and a whole section on noise ordinances. The motorized vehicle curfew was just one of many absurd regulations designed to give Patricia control over everyone's lives. But here's the thing about reading bylaws carefully. You learn exactly where the boundaries are. And I decided that from that point forward, I would operate exactly within those boundaries and not 1 inch beyond them. If someone needed help after 10 p.m., that was no longer my problem. The HOA had made their position crystal clear. February rolled into March, and Vermont remained buried under snow. We had another major storm system move through, dumping another 2 feet across the region. My phone started ringing that evening around 8:30. It was Janet Cooper, who lived up on Ridgeview Drive with her 2 young kids. "Marcus, thank God," she said, sounding frantic. My car slid off the driveway and got stuck in the ditch. I need to get to the pharmacy before they close at 9 to pick up my son's medication. He's got a severe asthma condition and we're completely out. Can you help? I looked at the clock, 8:35. Janet, I'd love to help, but if I take my snowmobile out and don't get back by 10, the HOA will fine me again. Can it wait until morning? Marcus, he needs his medication tonight. Without it, he could have a serious attack. I'm sorry, Janet. You'll need to call someone else. The words felt like acid in my mouth, but I meant them. I wasn't going to be Patricia's punching bag anymore. There is no one else. You're the only person with equipment who can get through this snow. Then I suggest you call Patricia Winters. She's the HOA president. Maybe she can make an exception to her curfew rule. I hung up and turned off my phone, hating myself but standing firm. This was what the HOA wanted, right? Everyone following the rules, no exceptions. The next morning, I learned that Janet had to call 911, and the fire department had to respond to get her out. The whole thing became a major emergency involving multiple agencies, when I could have handled it in 20 minutes. The town sent her a bill for the emergency response services. $800. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. People started to realize that Marcus Newman, the guy who'd always been there to help, wasn't answering calls anymore. Some people understood. Many didn't. But the ones who were really upset were Patricia's friends on the HOA board, because suddenly they had no one to rely on when things went wrong. The third week of March brought what the Weather Service called a once-in-a-decade storm system. This one was going to be worse than the January blizzard. The predictions were for 40 inches of snow, sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, and temperatures dropping to -15 before wind chill. The governor declared a state of emergency and told everyone to stay off the roads. My phone started ringing on the evening the storm hit. I didn't answer. It rang throughout the night as the wind howled and the snow piled up. By morning, we had nearly 3 feet of fresh powder, and it was still coming down. My voicemail was full of desperate messages. Tom Preston needed help with his generator again. The Kowalski family's heat had gone out. Greg Chen's wife had run out of insulin and needed to get to the pharmacy. Doug Miller's pipes had frozen and burst, and he needed help shutting off his water main. Every single message was from someone who needed assistance, and under any other circumstance, I would have been out there helping. But it was Patricia's fourth message that really caught my attention. Marcus, this is Patricia Winters. I'm calling because we have a serious situation. Several HOA board members are stranded and need assistance. I expect you to help immediately, as this is a community emergency. Call me back. The entitled tone, the expectation that I would just drop everything and help the people who'd find me for doing exactly that, was almost impressive in its audacity. I deleted the message and made myself breakfast. Around noon, my landline rang. I'd forgotten most people had that number. I picked up out of curiosity. Marcus, thank God. It was Patricia, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely rattled. We need your help. Sharon Donnelly is stuck at her house with chest pains and the ambulance can't get up the mountain. You need to transport her. I can't help you, Patricia. What do you mean you can't help? Someone's life is at stake. I mean that if I take my snowmobile out and don't make it back by 10 p.m., you'll fine me another $2,000. I can't afford your rules. This is different. This is an emergency. So was Sarah Miller going into labor. So was Tom Preston's generator failing. You made it very clear that the rules don't have exceptions. I'm just following the bylaws like you wanted. Marcus, please, I'll waive the fine. I'll make an exception this time. Will you put that in writing? Will you amend the bylaws to allow emergency exceptions? Will you refund my $2,000? There was a pause. I can't make those decisions without a board vote. Then I can't help you. I suggest you call 911. I hung up on her shocked silence. The storm continued for another full day. The calls kept coming, and I kept ignoring them. The fire department and EMS were completely overwhelmed trying to respond to emergencies across the entire county with limited resources. Several families in Aspen Ridge went without heat for extended periods. People burned through their emergency supplies. And through it all, I stayed warm in my house, watching the snow pile up, my perfectly maintained snowmobiles sitting idle in my garage. The backlash started almost immediately after the storm. I became the villain of Aspen Ridge Estates. People I'd helped dozens of times over the years stopped talking to me. I received angry letters and emails. Someone even spray-painted "selfish" on my mailbox, which was ironic given that defacing property was an HOA violation, but no fines were issued for that. But here's what the angry neighbors didn't understand. I hadn't created this situation. Patricia and the HOA board had. They decided that their petty rules were more important than common sense and community. I was just the one person unwilling to be punished for doing the right thing. The HOA called an emergency meeting in early April, once the snow had finally melted enough for everyone to get around safely. The community center was packed with angry residents, and I decided to attend. I wanted to hear what they had to say. Patricia stood at the front of the room in her usual outfit, though she looked more stressed than I'd ever seen her. Her perfect hair wasn't quite as perfect, and there were bags under her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We're here to discuss the unfortunate situation that occurred during the March storm. As many of you experienced, we faced numerous emergencies, and the one person in our community with the equipment and expertise to help refused to do so. Because you fined him for helping." Someone shouted from the back. I turned and saw it was Doug Miller, Sarah's husband. "My wife could have died in January and Marcus saved her. Then you fined him for it." "Mr. Miller, the bylaws clearly state the bylaws are garbage." Doug was on his feet now, his face red. "My daughter was born healthy because Marcus was willing to break your stupid curfew rule, and you punished him for it." Other voices joined in. Tom Preston stood up, his weathered face set in anger. "Marcus has helped me more times than I can count over the years. He's gotten my generator running, plowed my driveway when the service didn't show up, helped me with repairs. And this is how you treat him." Patricia tried to regain control. "Please, everyone, let me finish. We're here to discuss solutions. The board has proposed amending the motorized vehicle curfew to include exceptions for emergency services." "And what about Marcus's fine?" I spoke up for the first time, standing from my seat. "What about the $2,000 you made me pay for saving Sarah's life?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "That fine was levied according to the bylaws in place at the time. So you're keeping it." The board voted 3-2 that the fine stands, as it was legally applied. The room erupted. People were shouting. Several longtime residents were on their feet demanding Patricia's resignation. I just stood there watching the chaos, feeling a grim satisfaction. This was what happened when you prioritized control over community. The meeting dissolved into shouting matches and accomplished nothing. I left early, drove home, and poured myself a whiskey. My phone rang about an hour later. It was Steve, my lawyer. "Marcus, I just heard about the meeting. Listen, there might be something here. I've been doing some research into HOA law, and I think Patricia and her board might have overstepped. Can you send me all the documentation about the fine, the bylaws, and the timeline of when these rules were implemented? You think there's a case? Maybe. I need to look at the details. But if they didn't follow proper procedure in establishing these bylaws, everything they've done might be invalid. I spent the next several days compiling everything: meeting minutes, the certified letter about my fine, copies of the bylaws, email communications, everything. Steve reviewed it all with the focus of a surgeon. He called me back on a Thursday evening. "Marcus, I think we've got them." The bylaw changes Patricia pushed through last summer, including the motorized vehicle curfew, weren't properly implemented according to Vermont HOA law. "What do you mean?" "State law requires that any significant bylaw changes have to be approved by a majority of homeowners, not just the board. And they need to provide at least 30 days' notice before the vote, with the full text of the proposed changes." Patricia's board sent out a vague email about a meeting, pushed through all these changes with only 7 people present out of a community of 64 properties, and then claimed it was binding. So the rules aren't valid. Not just that. Every fine they've levied under these illegal bylaws could be challenged. And if they've been using HOA funds to enforce invalid rules, that's a potential case of mismanagement or even fraud. Something cold settled in my stomach. "Steve, how bad could this get for them?" "Depends on how deep we dig and what we find. At minimum, they'd have to refund all fines and redo the entire bylaw process correctly. At worst, if there's evidence of deliberate wrongdoing or misappropriation of funds, we could be looking at criminal charges." I thought about it for a long moment. Part of me wanted to absolutely bury Patricia and her board for what they'd done, but another part of me just wanted to live in peace in my home without harassment. "Let's start with the civil case," I said. "I want my fine back and I want these bylaws invalidated. What happens after that depends on how they respond." Steve filed the lawsuit 2 weeks later. I sued the Aspen Ridge Estates HOA, Patricia Winters personally, and the 4 board members who'd voted to fine me. The legal documents landed like a bomb in our little community. The lawsuit laid out everything: the improper implementation of bylaws, the fine levied against me for emergency services, the potential danger created by discouraging emergency assistance, and the emotional distress caused by the HOA's actions. We demanded the return of my $2,000, legal fees, and punitive damages. Patricia called me directly the day she was served. "Marcus, this is insane. You can't sue the HOA." I just did. "This will cost the association thousands in legal fees. You're hurting your neighbors." "No, Patricia. You hurt my neighbors when you made rules that prevented me from helping them during emergencies. You hurt the community when you decided control was more important than common sense. This is on you. We can settle this. Let's talk. Talk to my lawyer." The next few weeks were tense. The HOA hired their own attorney and the legal maneuvering began, but Steve was right about the bylaws. The more our legal team dug, the clearer it became that Patricia and her board had cut corners and ignored proper procedure in their rush to implement their control structure. What we discovered went deeper than just improper bylaws. Steve's paralegal found irregularities in the HOA's financial records. Patricia had been approving payments to various contractors and services without proper board oversight. There were thousands of dollars in questionable expenses that couldn't be adequately documented. "Marcus, I think you need to see this," Steve said during one of our meetings. He spread out a series of financial documents. Patricia approved a payment of $8,000 to Mountain Vista Landscaping for community beautification. But I can't find any evidence that this company actually exists. No business license, no website, no nothing. Where did the money go? That's what we need to find out, and it's not the only suspicious payment. There are at least 4 others like this over the past 18 months. totaling nearly $30,000. This had gone from a simple bylaw dispute to potential embezzlement. Steve contacted the Vermont Attorney General's office, and they opened an investigation into the Aspen Ridge Estates HOA. The community erupted into chaos when word got out. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and Patricia tried to maintain control, but it was clear she'd lost the neighborhood. People were demanding audits, answers, and her resignation. I attended that meeting and watched Patricia squirm under the questioning. Her perfectly maintained composure finally cracked when Tom Preston stood up and asked directly, "Did you steal money from this HOA? How dare you?" Patricia's voice was shrill. "I have worked tirelessly for this community." "Then show us the receipts," Tom said calmly. "Show us proof that Mountain Vista Landscaping did the work you paid them for." She couldn't. She stammered through non-answers and deflections, but she couldn't produce documentation. The board voted 4-1 to suspend Patricia from her duties pending the investigation, with only her closest ally, Sharon Donnelly, voting to keep her. An interim board took over, and their first action was to drop the HOA's lawsuit against me and offer a full settlement. I met with the interim board president, Michael Torres, a reasonable guy who'd been one of the few voices of sanity on the previous board. He looked exhausted. "Marcus, on behalf of the HOA, I want to apologize," he said. "What happened to you was wrong. We're prepared to refund your $2,000 fine, pay your legal fees, and publicly acknowledge that you were performing emergency services. We're also immediately suspending the motorized vehicle curfew and several other bylaws until we can properly review and revote on everything." "I appreciate that, Michael, but what about Patricia?" "That's above my pay grade now. The state ag's office has taken over, and they're doing a full forensic audit. If they find what we think they'll find, she's going to have much bigger problems than an HOA presidency." The investigation took 3 months. During that time, life in Aspen Ridge slowly returned to a semblance of normal. The community held a proper vote on HOA bylaws, and we implemented a new set of rules that actually made sense. There was an emergency exception for noise ordinances, reasonable guidelines for property maintenance, and strict oversight of financial matters. The state investigators found exactly what Steve had suspected. Patricia had created multiple fake companies and had been funneling HOA funds to herself over the course of 2 years. The total was close to $47,000. She'd been using the money to fund her lifestyle, paying for everything from her luxury car lease to her designer clothes. The criminal charges came in August: embezzlement, fraud, and falsifying records. Patricia was arrested at her home early one morning, and the local news picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested for Embezzling Thousands from Mountain Community." I watched the news coverage with mixed feelings. I'd never wanted it to go this far. I just wanted to help my neighbors without being punished for it. But Patricia had built this house of cards, and it was inevitable that it would collapse. The criminal trial happened in November. I was called as a witness, not because of the embezzlement, but to establish a pattern of behavior. I testified about the fine, the bylaws, and the way Patricia had operated the HOA like her personal fiefdom. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the financial records, testimony from multiple victims, and evidence that Patricia had deliberately concealed her actions. Her defense attorney tried to argue that the money was used for community purposes and that there had been bookkeeping errors, but the jury didn't buy it. She was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus fines. As they led her out of the courtroom, She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The perfectly put-together woman who'd ruled Aspen Ridge with an iron fist was gone, replaced by someone who'd gambled everything on control and greed and lost. The following spring brought new beginnings to Aspen Ridge. The HOA elected a new board with Michael Torres as president, and we established bylaws that balanced community standards with personal freedom and common sense. The motorized vehicle rules were completely rewritten to allow for emergency exceptions, and we created an official community emergency response system, with me as a volunteer coordinator. I started a training program for other residents who wanted to learn emergency winter response techniques. We acquired additional equipment using properly managed HOA funds, and we established protocols for everything from medical emergencies to power outages. Aspen Ridge transformed from a community ruled by fear and fines into one built on cooperation and mutual support. Doug and Sarah Miller invited me to their daughter's first birthday party. They'd named her Emma, and she was a beautiful kid with her mother's eyes and her father's smile. At the party, surrounded by neighbors who were becoming friends again, Sarah pulled me aside. "I never got to properly thank you," she said. "That night in the storm I was terrified, but you came through for us without hesitation, and then Patricia punished you for it. I'm so sorry we didn't stand up for you sooner. You had a newborn, Sarah. You had other priorities. Still, what you did, standing your ground, it saved this community. We were so focused on following rules that we forgot what actually matters." That summer, the HOA held its first annual community barbecue, something that hadn't happened in years. Nearly everyone showed up, and for the first time in a long time, Aspen Ridge felt like a real neighborhood again. People were laughing, kids were playing, and there was a sense of connection that had been missing. Tom Preston cornered me by the grill, a beer in hand. "You know what the best part about all this is?" he said. "What's that?" "I can run my damn leaf blower after 10 p.m. if I need to without worrying about some busybody fining me." He laughed, and I laughed with him. But the real test came the following winter, when we had our first major snowstorm under the new bylaws. My phone started ringing around midnight, and this time I answered without hesitation. "Marcus, it's Janet Cooper. I'm so sorry to call this late, but the Chen family has a burst pipe and their basement is flooding. Can you help? I'll be there in 10 minutes. I fired up my snowmobile and headed out into the storm, and this time I did it knowing that I wasn't just helping a neighbor. I was part of a community that valued the right things: people over rules, compassion over control, and cooperation over bureaucracy. The lawsuit settlement money came through that winter. After legal fees, I ended up with about $8,000. I could have kept it, could have called it compensation for everything I'd been through. Instead, I donated it to the HOA's emergency fund, earmarked specifically for upgrading our community emergency response equipment. We bought a second large snowmobile with a rescue sled, additional medical supplies, and backup communication equipment. Patricia served 2 years of her 4-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Florida to live with a sister and had no intention of ever returning to Vermont. Her house in Aspen Ridge was sold to cover her restitution payments. A young couple with twins bought it, and they became active members of the community, the kind of neighbors who actually cared about people instead of control. Sometimes I still think about that first fine, that moment when Patricia handed me a $2,000 penalty for saving a woman and her unborn child. It was such a small thing in some ways, just another example of bureaucratic overreach and HOA nonsense. but it sparked something that fundamentally changed our community for the better. The new HOA board even created an award in my honor, the Newman Community Service Recognition, given annually to a resident who goes above and beyond to help their neighbors. The irony of having an award named after me by the same organization that once fined me for helping people wasn't lost on anyone. But it represented growth, change, and a willingness to admit mistakes. I still live in my house at the edge of Aspen Ridge Estates, my snowmobiles ready in the garage for the next emergency. The difference now is that when I head out into a storm to help someone, I'm not worried about coming home to a fine. I'm part of a community that understands that some things are more important than quiet hours and property values. My workshop has become something of a community gathering place. People stop by to learn about equipment maintenance, to borrow tools, or just to talk. It's not unusual for me to have 3 or 4 neighbors hanging around on a Saturday afternoon, sharing stories and helping each other with projects. That's what a real community looks like. Not perfectly manicured lawns and strict curfews, but people who genuinely care about one another. Last month, I helped train the Johnson family's teenage son, Tyler, on snowmobile operation and emergency response. He's a good kid, really interested in helping out, and he reminds me of myself at that age. When we finished the training session, his father thanked me. "You know, Tyler was telling me about Patricia and everything that happened," Mr. Johnson said. "We moved here after all that went down, but the story's kind of legendary in town. I wanted you to know that what you did, standing up to her like that, it took real courage. I just wanted to help people without being punished for it. It was more than that. You showed everyone that sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to authority, even when it's hard. That's a valuable lesson." As I sit here on my porch, watching the first snow of the season start to fall, I think about how far we've all come. Aspen Ridge isn't perfect. We still have disagreements and occasional conflicts, but we handle them like neighbors now, with conversation and compromise instead of fines and threats. My phone is charged and ready. My snowmobiles are tuned up and fueled, and I've got the rescue sled prepped with fresh emergency supplies. When the big storms come this winter, and they will come, I'll be ready to help. And this time, I'll do it knowing that my community supports me, values me, and understands that some rules need to be flexible enough to allow for human decency. The lights are coming on in houses across the neighborhood as evening settles in. Smoke rises from chimneys, and I can see families gathering for dinner through lit windows. This is what Patricia never understood. A community isn't built on conformity and control. It's built on trust, mutual support, and the understanding that we're all in this together. My phone buzzes with a text from Michael Torres. "Weather service says we might get 12 inches tonight. Emergency response team on standby," I text back. "Ready when needed." That's the difference now. We're prepared, we're organized, and we're united. The HOA serves the community instead of ruling it. And if someone needs help at 3 in the morning during a blizzard, they know they can call, and someone will answer. I finish my coffee and head inside as the snow starts to pick up. Whatever this winter brings, whatever challenges we face, I know that Aspen Ridge Estates is ready. We learned our lessons the hard way through conflict and crisis, embezzlement and criminal trials. But we learned them, and that $2,000 fine that started everything, it turned out to be the best investment our community ever made, even though I was the one who had to pay it. Sometimes it takes a catalyst to create real change, and sometimes that catalyst is one person saying, "Enough is enough," and refusing to back down. I glance at the framed copy of that first fine on my office wall. I kept it as a reminder. A reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, that communities can lose their way, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in unreasonable systems, even when there's a cost. The snow is really coming down now, and I know before morning someone will probably need help. When that call comes, I'll be ready. Not because I have to be, not because I'm afraid of fines or rules, but because that's what neighbors do. And in the end, that's all I ever wanted, to be a good neighbor in a good community. Aspen Ridge Estates isn't perfect, but it's ours. We built it together from the ashes of Patricia's controlling regime, and every day we work to make it better. That's not just good HOA policy. That's just being human.